Saikat Majumdar is the head of the Department Creative Writing and Professor of English and Creative Writing at Ashoka University. His central scholarly focus has been the emergence of English as a language of world literature. He studies this in conjunction with the cultural history of the global British Empire and the subsequent phases of decolonization and globalization. In this video, he talks about his research on English as an international literary language, his intervention into the field of modern and contemporary Anglophone literary studies, his work in literary criticism, and as a celebrated novelist.
Within this larger field of interest, I found my publications have tended to ask certain fundamental questions. That is, how do the categories, how do certain categories get created within colonial modernity? How does colonial modernity create a certain hierarchical structure within the world? That is, how are some spaces considered metropolitan and cosmopolitan? And how are other spaces considered peripheral and provincial? Obviously this is the work of colonialism and globalization, and how this kind of division of places within a certain kind of a global hierarchy, how has it created artistic migration, movement of exchange, and other kinds of cultural movement across the globe. My current research project again asks a question: is literary criticism a professional act, or is it the work of an amateur? And I find that in many ways literary criticism is something that is held in a kind of a productive tension between amateur and professional impulse. And I think this again applies to artistic criticism on the whole, that it is something art is of interest to anybody, but then how do we specialize? How do we professionalize? What is the meaning of getting a degree in literary studies? Is it different from getting a degree in economics or engineering? Even I asked this question again within my preferred archive, which is again the global British Empire and the Anglophone literatures that is created. And even here I find that British imperialism standardized a certain kind of education, a certain kind of curriculum all across the empire. There are differences, but there are similarities too. And that created a certain kind of university. And in many ways, the very project of English literary studies, as scholars have established, was pioneered in the colony, notably in India. In the 19th century, at a time when obviously only the classics were studied in Oxford and Cambridge. And what I observe is how this kind of colonial education, which is obviously an imperial project, has actually encouraged certain individuals sort of around the university, how it has created a certain aspiration of a cosmopolitan education, and how it has actually pushed them away from the education in parts of autodidacticism. In sort of, they've become kind of enlightened amateurs. I mean, I look at figures like C.L.R. James and B.S. Naipaul from the Caribbean, Nirod C. Chaudhary, Pankaj Mishra, again, Jamaica Kincaid there are many figures who have inhabited this kind of ideological structure of British colonial education, and it has kind of pushed them in a different direction. The heavily bureaucratized university has kind of had an impact on them. And this, ironically, later on, many of these thinkers become public intellectuals of wide appeal. And my argument is that a certain amateur status is actually integral to their identity as a public intellectual. In some ways, they become post-professional amateurs. In some ways, they bypass professionalism altogether. And in their work on literary criticism, you get a very interesting take on what criticism can be when it shows a certain amateur impulse, as well as a very sophisticated professional one. in my first academic monograph, Prose of the World, I was trying to ask a very fundamental question, a very simple question. How is modern literature different from non-modern literature? What makes modern literature uniquely modern? The answer was something I found that in some ways, to simplify, that pre-modern literature, classical literatures, literature of the epics, often have great heroic themes, whether it's war, romance, big subjects. Whereas in literature of modernity, something very banal, like a mark on the wall, just staring at something. I mean, Chekhov famously said that, put your cigarette down on the ashtray and I'll write a short story around it. So in a way, the truly distinguishing mark of modern literature is that it can take something very trivial, something very ordinary, and create art out of it. My special line of inquiry is how is the question of ordinary energized within colonial and postcolonial literatures? How is a postcolonial everyday configurated? What are the politics? Is it merely kind of formal or aesthetic construction, or is there certain politics to it? And I found that in many ways, it is also a deeply political phenomenon, the embodiment of the ordinary in colonial and postcolonial literatures. When I work as a popular, kind of a writer for popular magazines or newspapers, which I've been doing a lot the last 5-6 years, what I find most interesting is that it allows me to assume a more private voice and more intimate voice to talk to the readers, which sometimes conventional academic scholarship doesn't allow, because that's more about effacing yourself. I can talk like a storyteller, and yet it is not exactly telling a story. It is actually connecting that intimate voice with larger issues in society and culture. In my case, mostly literature, art, and education, the three issues I mostly write about. So I really enjoy that. I really enjoy the bridging of that very private vision with the larger issues of society.